Now that we've covered the fundamentals, we're going to move our focus over to using Tailwind to design and implement the sorts of common components you might need to build in your day-to-day work. We're going to start with a basic image card, something like what you see here on Airbnb. Let's jump over to the code. So what you see here is sort of like a workbench that I've set up as a Vue CLI app, so we have a place to sort of build out this component. So what you see here is sort of a root app.vue component, where I've just got some classes in place to sort of center whatever we build over in the viewport over here. I've also created this sort of placeholder property card component, which is where we're going to actually build the thing that we're designing. Now down below, I've also set up a bunch of placeholder data for the card that we're going to be working on, so we don't have to hard code that information into the component itself. Okay, so the way that I like to get started is just by dumping in all of the information with no styles and just figuring out what to do with it. So let's head over to this property card. You see we've got an empty div here, and we're accepting the property as a prop in Vue so that we have access to all of that data. So the first thing we need to do is just drop in all this content. Let's start by creating an image tag, and we'll have that point to property.image URL with some alt text pointing to property.image alt. And now under this, let's drop in the actual information about the property. So if you look over here, we've got, the title, we've got some pricing information, some information about reviews. We also have the number of bedrooms and the number of bathrooms. So why don't we start by displaying the title. So depending on where you're actually going to use this component, you might use an H2 or an H3 or an H4. Since we're just sort of designing it in isolation here, I'm just going to arbitrarily choose an H4. So we'll just do the property.title here. And then maybe under that, we'll have a div that has the bedroom and bathroom information. So maybe we'll do something like property.beds. And then maybe we'll throw in like a bullet to sort of separate things and do property.baths. And then under here, why don't we drop in maybe some pricing information? So I think it's property.formatted price to sort of get the sort of pre-stringified value in dollars. And then we could do something like per week, so this will show, $1,900 per week. And then finally, why don't we drop in some information about the rating? So we can do something like property.rating, and this is a star rating out of 5. So why don't we say out of 5 stars, and then maybe we can say based on property.review count reviews. So this way people can tell if it's a popular destination or if it only has a small number of reviews. Okay, so now that we've got all the data in place, why don't we add some styling to try and get this sort of looking more like sort of a basic card. So the first thing that I think we should do is maybe add a background color, because right now it just matches the background color behind it because it's transparent. So right on the root level of the card here, why don't we do something like class equals BG white. Okay, so now we do have that white background in the content area. But now if you take a look down here, you can see it looks really cramped because all this content goes right to the edges of the card. So the first thing you might think to do is add some padding to the actual root level element itself, like maybe something like P6. And you'll see that this does create some space around the actual content, but it also creates some space around the image. So for this reason, the way that I like to design cards is to think about sort of the root level element as just sort of being the outside of the card, sort of the edges and how you want things to look there. And then for actual content, I think it makes the most sense to group this stuff together in its own container and add any padding that we want to add there, because that way you can differ the padding based on the type of content in the different sections of the card. So let's get rid of this P6 here, and let's just add another div, and we'll move all of this content inside of it. And this is where we can add a class to do something like P6. Okay, and now you can see that the image is sort of a full bleed image at the top, which looks pretty nice. And we have some padding just around the actual content. Now, the next thing that sort of stands out to me is that right now things look a little bit harsh with these really sharp square corners. So why don't we try adding a bit of a border radius to this card to soften things up? So I'm just going to go to the root element here. I'm going to start with rounded LG to add a nice big border radius. Now you might be thinking, why didn't that take effect? Because if you look at the image here, you still see the square corners. But if you look down below, it's a little bit hard to see right now because there's not much contrast between the white and the gray. But the rounded corners did take effect at the bottom, just not at the top. So why is this happening? Well, you'll see that if we comment out this image, that the actual card does have a border radius at the top, but what's happening is the image, because the image has square corners of course, is bleeding outside of the card. So the square corners of the image are poking out on top of the rounded corners of the card. So to prevent this, we can tell the root container to hide any overflowing content. And we can do that by using overflow hidden. And now this will crop any of its contents. So now you see we do have those nice rounded corners. Finally, to address this sort of low contrast difference between the white background and the gray background here, why don't we add a subtle border to the card to make it stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going to add a border class here and let's see how that looks. Yeah, and that looks a little bit nicer. So now we have this nice line between the card and the background that makes it stand out a little bit more. So now that we have sort of the basic bones in place for this card, in the next lesson we're going to focus on making all of this text content feel professionally designed.